Welcome to the Infowars Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Friday, August 23rd, 2013. Now, our top story tonight is, what actor is going to play Batman? I'm sure that was what was on your mind. With war about to break out in the Middle East, which could turn into a world war, with the White House pushing for a race war here at home, and with the government spying on your every move and breaking every law to do so, the most important thing that was trending on Twitter and the mainstream media today was, who's going to play Batman? A lot of pushback that Ben Affleck has been chosen perhaps to play that. You know, it's hard to believe that the really important issues are not being covered, but it's also hard to believe the way these important issues are being spun in the media. Now, CNN had an exclusive interview with Obama because, of course, CNN is his favorite propaganda media outlet. And he had these comments to say about what's going on in Syria. He believes that he's got a Gulf of Tonkin incident in Syria that he can use to start another war. He said, Assad's forces have used chemical weapons, and the time within which a decision about such an action must be made has been shortened. In other words, as the headline says, key decisions are nearing on both Syria and Egypt. Now listen to this other quote that Obama had. He said, if the U.S. goes in and attacks another country without a UN mandate and without clear evidence that can be presented, then there are questions in terms of whether international law supports it. Do you hear that? It's just like Bush #1 in the first Iraq War. He said, if this is done without a UN mandate about international law, well, what about American law? What about a declaration of war from the U.S. Congress? Doesn't care. Doesn't care about that, just like Bush didn't care about that. You think there's a difference between Bushes and Obama? Do you think there's a difference, for instance, between Obama and McCain? Think about this. We've got an attack being set for a Syrian invasion in motion following a reported chemical attack. This is a story from Infowars.com. Kurt Nemo writes, he's got a quote from John McCain. This is what McCain says about the war. He says, it's a long past for the United States and our friends and allies to respond to Assad's continuing mass atrocities in Syria. Really? Continuing? With decisive action, including limited military strikes to degrade Assad's air power and ballistic missile capabilities, said John McCain, the other choice that we were presented with in 2008. So Obama wants to move in as long as we've got the UN approval and don't break any international law. But of course, McCain wants to go in right away. So the next time you have an election and somebody is trying to push on you that you should vote for the lesser of two evils, just understand there's no difference between the foreign policy between the Bushes and Obamas and the McCains. They're all the same. They're all doing what the military-industrial complex wants them to do. And there's evidence now that the U.S. is not even waiting for even the UN to okay this. There's a report from Max Lavo based on an article from Le Figaro. The title is, Hundreds of American troops and CIA operatives have entered Syria. He says, if the following from France's second largest newspaper, Le Figaro, is accurate, then we must assume that war is now a foregone conclusion. According to our information, the regime's opponents, this is Le Figaro saying this, supervised by Jordanian, Israeli, and American commandos moving toward Damascus since mid-August. This attack could explain the possible use of the Syrian president and chemical weapons. According to the information presented by Le Figaro, the first trained in guerrilla warfare by the Americans and Jordan Syrian troops reportedly entered into action since mid-August in southern Syria in the region of Deraa. A first group of 300 men, probably supported by Israeli and Jordanian commandos, as well as men of the CIA, crossed the border August 17. A second would have joined the 19th. And the French paper suggests that perhaps the Syrian government launched the gas attack because of this invasion. Not likely. The gas wasn't directed at them, but more importantly, Syria and their ally Russia know that this would galvanize opposition against them. They have no reason to do that. It's important to note that the U.S. standard method of operation to justify involvements in a war is to stage an attack that they then blame on the party that they wish to attack, called a false flag. Those who know real American history see an ominous connection between CIA commandos entering Syria and a gas attack a few days later. Now, of course, the French paper is saying, well, if the U.S. is invaded, then maybe that's why Assad attacked a village. That wouldn't make any sense. He doesn't have any reason to do that. He knows that that's going to make him an international pariah. He knows that that is the tripwire that they've been looking for. And in spite of what McCain says, there haven't been numerous attacks like this. They've all been debunked. And there's evidence that this one may not be genuine as well. Chemical weapons experts are saying that this doesn't look like a sarin attack. In another article from Infowars from Paul Joseph Watson titled U.S. Trained Rebels Move Toward Damascus Days Before Chemical Weapons Attack, he quotes Paula Vanenen of the Finnish Institute for Verification of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And this person questions, says, at the moment, I am not totally convinced because the people that are helping them are without any protective clothing and without any respirators. In a real case, they would have been contaminated. They would have also been having symptoms. Now, although some experts are claiming nerve agent gas used was likely sarin, he says, compare the photos of the protective gear worn by Japanese chemical weapons specialists who did clean a metro station in Tokyo 8 hours after a real bottle of sarin gas was thrown in 1995. Compare that to the complete lack of protective gear worn by those seen handling victims in the video footage released earlier this week. Now understand, people really died, children really died, but when we're talking about the justification for war, it really matters how they died, and it matters who killed them, because that's the basis of them pushing for war. And also understand that once this war starts out, it is going to be a lot more people dying and suffering, dying agonizing deaths. So we need to look at this very carefully. We need to not be goaded into jumping into a war as Obama and McCain and the one war party that we have running Washington wants to do. That's precisely what they want. Now here at home, we have the White House pushing for a U.S. race war. And in an article that was co-written by Alex Jones and Paul Joseph Watson, they ask, is the media covering up the beginning of a race war? George Zimmerman's acquittal last month drew a line under nearly 18 months of hand-wringing over the threat posed to black people by racially charged hate crimes. Yet we have a case this week where a baseball player from Australia, Lane, was slaughtered by a gunshot to the back as part of a gang initiation by 3 juveniles, an incident which the media tried to downplay initially as, quote, bored teens. 2 of the suspects are black, and it subsequently emerged that one of the suspects had posted racist tweets on his account before the murder. Now, of course, Barack Obama, who's personally inserted himself into the Trayvon Martin case on 2 separate occasions, said he was not familiar with Lane's murder, according to the White House spokesman. And in light of several high-profile black-on-white murders in recent days, the invective has been noticeably less, virtually non-existent. And there on the screen, you can see 3 people that in just the last couple of days have been brutally murdered. 2 of them shot. The elderly man in the center is an 88-year-old World War II veteran who was beaten to death. Now, compare this to the Trayvon Zimmerman case, which got essentially 24/7 coverage. It was always a lead story, always with a racist charge background being put in there to try to goad this race war into happening. Why is it that they're not talking about these racial attacks now? Well, because that's exactly what they were trying to stoke. When these kids go on Twitter and talk about how they wanted to kill white people, beat white people, they're not attacked, don't have their accounts shut down. And of course, the White House and the mainstream media is not complaining about that. And in the case of one of these people that died, David Stantucci, the police initially, wanting to avoid any appearance of a racially charged crime, said that it was a burglary. Although he didn't have his wallet stolen, he didn't have his car keys taken, and he didn't have his cell phone taken. So they're going to every length that they can to ignore this, to downplay this when it is black on white, but when it is white on black, possibly, they try to play that up into something that, in the case of Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, a jury agreed did not happen. Now, of course, there's another agenda just besides the race war. They also use this as a case for gun control. And they are coming in on these cases with gun control. Piers Morgan was quick to jump in on his agenda. And as usually, he likes to put this in as a gun control issue. This is what he tweeted. When an innocent Australian student is shot dead in Oklahoma for fun, America's gun crisis becomes the world's problem. Isn't that amazing? And then when people criticize him for blindly pushing his gun control agenda, he pushed back and said, memo to all the idiots tweeting me that the Australian student murder was a race crime. 1 of the 3 killers was white. Well, you know, when you look at this, he's saying this on Twitter, obviously not looking at the tweets that one of the accused killers put out there, which was obviously a racist tweet saying that he was going around attacking people just based on their race. But if he's going to blame a drive-by shooting and call for gun control, if he's going to blame the gun in that as opposed to the people who are pulling the trigger, why doesn't he call for banning cars? You know, you can't have a drive-by shooting if you don't have a car. The car was every bit as much of an instrument in the drive-by shooting as the gun was. But, you know, if you take away the gun, if you take away the car, they're just going to ambush people and kill them with a machete if they have that kind of hate that's been stoked by the mainstream media and the White House over and over again for a year and a half in the Trayvon Martin case. Now, why do they need a race war? Why do they need that kind of distraction? And why is the Homeland Gestapo building up for a massive civil war? Well, we have an amazing memo that was released today. It was covered on Infowars.com. It was written by Greg Palast. And the title of it is The Confidential Memo at the Heart of the Global Financial Crisis. And what he points out is that he got this memo sent to him from somebody. He says, when a little birdie dropped in the end game memo, is what he calls it, through my window, its content was so explosive, so sick, and just plain evil he couldn't believe it, but he actually did go through and verify it. And this is what's interesting about it. The players, the Treasury official playing the banker's secret endgame was Larry Summers. And of course, Larry Summers is Obama's choice to become chairman of the US Federal Reserve. And if the memo is authentic, he says, then Summers shouldn't be going to the Fed. He should be going to the prison. But he verified it as being authentic. And the interesting thing about this memo is that it is from Timothy Geithner, who was a leading player at the Federal Reserve in New York during the TARP fiasco, and is now Treasury Secretary under Obama. And this is what the memo said. He said, as we enter the end game of the World Trade Organization financial services negotiation, I would believe it would be a good idea for you to touch base with CEOs. He sent this to Larry Summers, and he points out here that if Larry Summers had called him, that would have triggered, under U.S. law, a public law. So what he does is he puts the phone numbers of the people, these few bankers that he wants to get involved in there. Of course, one of them is the criminal John Corzine. And the whole point of this was the end game essentially was to deregulate the banks with Glass-Steagall and to allow them to create these financial derivative markets, which, as he points out, J.P. Morgan would soon after this memo have an $88 trillion pseudo security on their books, because of course those derivatives are not worth that much money. They can claim that they're worth that much money, and then they go around to different countries and tell them that they need to be bailed out or else. And then once the countries do that, then they declare those countries financially insolvent, lower their credit ratings, and then take over their countries, as we've seen time and again. In Italy and in Greece, we see Goldman Sachs people being put in positions of power and taking out democratically elected leaders. Now, if you want to know what these preparations for martial law look like, what the federalization and the militarization of the police look like, take a look at this report from Jakari Jackson.
Another active shooter drill comes to Central Texas. If the feds weren't involved, why was the Department of Homeland Security in attendance?
However, I think a representative from Homeland Security came just to oversee what we're doing. Not oversee, they don't have anything to do with it.
Yeah, I just came to check.
Yeah,
And why don't the heads of the police and fire department know about it?
Is it true that the Department of Homeland Security was here to observe this event this morning?
To my knowledge, no, sir.
That's not true?
No, sir. Not that I saw. They were never here.
That's tonight on PrisonPlanet.tv.
Well, in our final piece of news today, we have an update on the NSA spying scandal that involved all the big internet companies. The Guardian reports that the NSA paid millions to cover PRISM compliance costs for tech companies. The NSA paid millions of dollars to cover the costs of major internet companies involved in the PRISM surveillance program after a court ruled that some of the agency's activities were unconstitutional. An NSA newsletter entry marked Top Secret, dated December 2012, discloses the huge cost that this entailed, and it said last year's problems resulted in multiple extensions to certification's expiration dates, which cost millions of dollars for PRISM providers to implement each successive extension. These are costs covered by something called a special source operation. And the disclosure that taxpayers' money was used to cover the company's compliance costs raises new questions over the relationship between Silicon Valley and the NSA. Since the existence of the program was first revealed by The Guardian and The Washington Post on June 6th, these internet companies have repeatedly denied all knowledge of it and insisted that they only handed over user data in response to specific legal requests from the authorities. Well, notice a few things about this. First of all, this was a ruling by the secret FISA court. Now, this is a court that has doesn't have two different sides arguing the case. There's no publication of their decisions, and yet they maintain that these decisions alter not only our law, but alter the Constitution, that they're setting precedents, but nobody sees these decisions. So, of course, nobody knew about what was going on. And we're told that there's oversight about what the NSA is doing. Well, clearly you can't oversee something that you don't know anything about. But it's even worse than that. Obama is telling us, blatantly lying to us, saying that there's not even any question about what's going on with the NSA.
At some point, does the technology outpace the laws that are in place and the protections that are in place? And do some of these systems end up being like a loaded gun out there that somebody at some future point could abuse? Because there are no allegations, and I am very confident, knowing the NSA and how they operate, that purposely somebody's out there trying to abuse this program or listen in on people's email.
You're confident in that?
I am confident in that.
Did you hear that? Obama said there's not even an allegation. There's been plenty of allegations. There's been allegations that the tech companies were in on this, and that's what this proves as well. It proves that these internet companies were involved from the beginning in this program. And for those of you who don't think this is a big issue, so maybe some Republicans who love the security state, notice that this is millions of dollars that are being spent on this. Maybe that'll get your attention. Well, that brings us to today's quote, and that is from Tom Brokaw. He says, "A common lament of the World War II generation is the absence of personal responsibility."
Today we're joined by Syrian Girl, who's going to explain a little bit more about what's happened in Syria, and a very unfortunate thing with the children. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Egypt. Mimi, thank you so much for being here today with us on the Nightly News.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, you've got a lot going on in Egypt right now. Start by just telling our viewers a little bit about Syria and how you became the Syrian Girl, just really quick for those who might not know you yet.
Well, I was interviewed on YouTube a year into the struggle that was happening in my country by a YouTube channel, Morris. It's 108, Morris 108. And I had already been involved politically for years before that, but anonymously. And basically I had to get over the fear of becoming a public figure and showing my face to the world and all of that entails. I didn't think that it would be, that I would get any views or that people would watch. I didn't see where it was going to go. It just sort of happened. But I was afraid at the time of course, being, threatened by crazy people online, the usual thing. So that's how I became Syrian Girl, was that one day I got called for an interview by Alex Jones, and Morris suggested I open up my own channel, and I've been speaking politically on that ever since. It's Syrian Girl Partisan, and I have a Twitter account which is Partisan Girl.
Great. Well, it's hard to talk about what's happening to the children in Syria right now, but who do you think is behind the gas?
Well, I think since a year ago, the people who even brought up chemical weapons before any incident occurred, before anyone suggested that they might be used, or the conflict would even reach this point, was the US government and Obama, and then again Israel at the United Nations. And, there was no indication before that. And I think the agenda was clear to make serious chemical weapons an issue, because the game plan is always to try to disarm nations from their weapons of mass destruction, and which are a deterrent against aggression, because of what they can do. They are city destroyers. So of course an invading army would be afraid of that. So that's been the trend for Iraq. There was disarmament before invasion, and for Libya as well. And of course Afghanistan, Somalia, they never had WMDs to begin with, so they were an easy target. So going back to Syria and who I believe did this, I think that I'm not going to put the blame on any specific group inside Syria, because it doesn't exactly matter if it was Al-Qaeda, if it was the FSA, if it was like corrupt people. It could have been spies, for all we know, that could have come in from anywhere. And as you know, the borders are wide open. But I think that the agenda behind bringing up chemical weapons and trying to push it in the UN is clear, and it's clear who benefits from it, and that is the global elite who have taken over the US government and have basically brought many nations to their knees, and many nations to work against their own people's interests and follow the global elite's interests. And that's who I believe is behind it.
As of last night, I know that no one particular group has really come forward on this. What do you think about Iran? It's really quiet over there.
Iran, what I believe of most of the nations that we see is that the nation states, if they're not controlled, if they're independent, they're going to act in what is their interests. And that's not always the right thing. And sometimes it is the right thing by them, and it's within their right. So on Iran, I would say I support Iran in its struggle against imperialism, or in its struggle against being taken over or suppressed. And Syria and Iran are allies, of course. But I'm not going to say that all of Iran's actions across the Middle East have been helpful against imperialism. For example, in Iraq, Iran actually worked with the Americans in invasion inside Iraq in order to suppress any resistance movement and to create sectarianism. And you could say that it's worked in Iran's favor in some ways, but I think in the big picture, it works against everybody's favor. But again, Syria and Iran are allies. They have a mutual defense pact. And the assaults against Iran's sovereignty is something that anybody who believes in people's right to sovereignty, to independence, should be opposed to.
Well, and so with that being said, Egypt is it's all over the place. There's so many things happening there. Where do you start to break it down, and how does Syria fit into the equation with what's happening in Egypt right now?
Well, for decades, a lot of the Middle East have been living under dictatorships or monarchies. And some of those dictatorships and monarchies were the greatest allies of the US. And some of them were the worst enemies, and some of them were allies and then enemies. So just to say that the US wants democracy in the Middle East is very naive. And in 2011, we saw these Arab Springs happening, as they call them, all these revolutions happening all over the Middle East, only they replaced a lot of the secular governments with theocratic Islam-based governments. Now, as a I don't think that it's in any country's interests to divide their nation by making the figurehead just one religion, any religion. It's not specific to one religion. So the reason for that was twofold. You could say that Qatar and Saudi Arabia were funding a lot of these revolutions and were making them happen because they wanted to sponsor, especially Qatar wanted to sponsor, Qatar and Turkey wanted to sponsor the Muslim Brotherhood, which is one of the political movements that have never really taken power in the Middle East up until now, 2011, but have always attempted to do so since 40 years or more. So in Egypt, you had the Muslim Brotherhood in power under Morsi, and his government was extremely unpopular.
And why was that? Why was it unpopular? And why do you think it's taken so long for the Muslim Brotherhood to get into power?
Well, it's an unpopular movement. I mean, it's people look at it under suspicion. They see it as the worst of two evils. I'm not saying they don't have support. They do have support, but they don't have support of the majority, at least not in Egypt. And it's clear by what happened in the second time, the second spring, you know, maybe they'll call it that, but actually they're calling it a military coup. But I want to say that...
well, over there maybe, but not here apparently. Obama doesn't want to call it a coup.
Well, with the return of the military government, like Egypt was, before the Muslim Brotherhood, was under the Mubarak regime, which was despotic and which, you know, was pretty much one of the pawns of the New World Orders. They had a massive amount of IMF debt. Their people were not under great living conditions. So now to see the Muslim Brotherhood being pulled down and this old government returned, which of course had its ties to the US and Israel, I don't think it's like I don't think we should be too excited or too happy like it's the greatest thing that ever happened. I think it's clear that it shows that secularism is still alive in the Middle East. But it also shows that maybe democracy isn't, you know, and I say that with a lot of skepticism because I don't believe democracy is alive anywhere, nor was it under Morsi. But there's not really a change now in Egypt. There's just a return of the old way.
In your opinion, what would be the first step to peace in the Middle East?
I think the first step to peace in the Middle East would be to end intervention from the outside to try to take control of those countries, and occupation inside the Middle East. And when I say occupation, I don't just mean that the US has invaded and has troops in a country. That should go too. That's fueling all of the problems and instigating infighting between people. But I also mean the occupation of Palestine, because since the fall of the Ottoman Empire and World War II, when the Balfour Declaration was signed and Israel was formed, which was 30% of the Jewish population in Palestine, taking 70% of the land, that was really the start and the seed of sectarianism. Because before that, for hundreds of years, Jews and Christians and Muslims were living in Palestine, or you could call it, you know, ancient Israel, whatever the name, but they were living in that land peacefully together. And it was the land of them all. But the Zionist ideology came in and said, no, this land only belongs to the Jews. And anybody who isn't Jewish, get out. And that's why you've ended up with a piece of land called Israel now that used to have a majority of Palestinians and now has a majority of Europeans that immigrated into the land and pushed the people that lived there out. And that injustice is ongoing. It's not something that happened 50 years ago. There's still 3 million refugees living scattered all over the world. They're Palestinian, but the Zionist ideology is still there. So in order to preserve the idea that the land can only be Jewish, those people that still hold the key to their homes are not allowed to go back to their homes. They're not allowed, the refugees are not allowed to return to the land that is now Israel. And that seed of injustice has created an ongoing conflict. And from that source that wants to keep hold of this land's ideology, you know, we see lots of infighting, and I would say that the end of Zionism might not be the complete cure, because of course there's always going to be agendas to try to control each other. There's always been wars, but that would definitely be a step forward for the Middle East, for people to decide that they can share the land. You know, I believe in a one-state solution where Palestinians and Israelis, Jews, Muslims, Christians live in one state, an equal state where people are equal citizens. And it's not known as a Jewish state or a Muslim state. You know, it's known as the people's state. If we can achieve that, that is the dream. And for world peace or total peace in the future, in the long run, the only thing I can think is that people need to grow up internally. I can't think of any other way right now. I'm afraid, you know, I have no solutions. There's always going to be somebody that wants to steal somebody else's meal. So that's until everybody grows up out of that or recognizes people like that and stops them, then we're just going to keep going the way we're going.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mimi, for giving us your opinion and letting us know what's going on. And I look forward to doing this again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Syrian Girl. Check out her Twitter to get all the latest Syrian Girl news. And you can also go to YouTube and check that out. She's actively putting things out in the internet universe to help move forward the cause, which is for us to have global freedom, no more tyranny.